Welcome to One in Conversation. I'm Michael Civita, Director of Communications at Catholic Near East Welfare Association. This year, our magazine celebrates its 50th year of publication. The flagship of Catholic Near East Welfare Association, One serves as this agency's primary vehicle to inform and inspire its primary audience, North American Catholics, about the people we are privileged and humbled to serve. Much has happened in the Middle East, Northeast Africa, India, and Eastern Europe since One began to cover these regions in 1974. Our editorial team thought that by highlighting some key articles published in these last 5 decades, we could shed some light on these tumultuous times, their impact on CNEWA, and how One reported on those times. We are pleased to welcome John Esposito, Distinguished Professor of Religion, International Affairs, and Islamic Studies, and the founding director of the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Professor Esposito. It's so good to have you with us here for our viewers. Can you bring us up to date where we are in the Middle East and in North Africa since One published Is Islam Compatible with Democracy in its July 2011 issue? What has changed? Has anything remained the same?
I think, we've seen a major transition and shift with the Arab Spring, which stunned everybody, including not only the rulers and the government, but most experts. There was a sense that there was a turning point that was taking place, that indeed, unexpected, there was a good expectation, certainly in Egypt and in Tunisia, that one would see elections, an electoral system in place, and in a broad sense, working towards a development of a democratic country. Then what happened in the short term was the overthrow of the government, which raised a lot of questions in the sense that the opposition there could have waited until elections that were coming up fairly soon. But of course, that was a coup. That was a stunner, that how quickly it happened. Part of that, I would see the U.S. played a very mixed role on that. Both the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, but also the Obama administration. In the very early days, each of them would have a slightly different message to cover their bases. And so one would say, we respect the right of the people to express themselves in this government. And another would say, Hosni Mubarak is a longtime ally of ours. What we know now is that Hillary Clinton, from the beginning, really didn't want to see a move on that part. And then we do know that in terms of Obama, refused to recognize that there was a coup. Immediately, that signals the fact that the U.S. wanted to have a relationship. And the reason why he didn't say it was a coup was that if he had, the agreement, long-time agreement in terms of aid from the U.S. to Egypt would have had to be revisited and then worked through Congress, et cetera. Now, on the other hand, you had the Tunisian example, which was remarkable. When you see that Rashid Ghannouchi and Ennahda came to power. For one reason, Ghannouchi had been in exile in London for some 20 years, 20 or 21 years. And, I think realistically, there wasn't a sense that anything was going to happen with regard to the Ben Ali government or any opportunity. And then when you did have the Ben Ali being basically forced out of government, the idea that Ghannouchi and Ennahda could come back and compete in elections, having been invisible, let alone win and win handily, was remarkable. But that too, after a short period of time, and I will say, it would have been nice, but in fact, the U.S. did not provide any significant support for that government. What we then see is a challenge on the part of the secular forces and other forces in the country. And it's important to note that Ghanouchi ahead of time had said that if they came into power, he would welcome all three of the major secular parties. And two of them said, in effect, yes, they accepted that. Another did not. But in fact, the secular forces in general and others began to challenge the government. And Anakta set an example for, if you will, a commitment to democratization. That is, by at times responding and backing out of certain political situations. And indeed, when a major election came up, there was a division within Anakta. There were those that felt that the people who were in government just before should not be allowed to run in this first race, for a lot of obvious reasons. I was actually personally stunned. And in fact, I happened to be in Tunis when Ghanouchi had come back from moving throughout the country to try to convince his followers that indeed it should be a totally open election. And we had a discussion of that the night he got back at his home. My sense was it was asking, for trouble. I mean, given the entrenched elites that existed, and therefore the opposition, and so certainly what happened was that Anakta then became part of the government, but not the dominant force in government. Ghanouchi became the Speaker of the Parliament, etc. But what we see in the last few years is a coup that occurred, and that basically has crushed pretty much any and all opposition. Ghanouchi and many of his followers, as well as many others, have been imprisoned now with sentences of multiple years. So that's a big shift. And then the other question is, well, what about the other countries in the region? That is within the Middle East, and particularly the Arab countries. And there, you have a situation in which we know that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were supportive of the coup, for example, in Tunisia, and were supportive of the coup in Egypt in particular. The fear was not that Islamists were going to come from the region into the country. The fear was that an example was set for the ability to do what would have been not seen as conceivable, and that is to overthrow a government or to really challenge in a very significant way. And this is within countries which basically most of them were authoritarian governments. And so that's why you had this then support. And indeed, right after the fall in Egypt, for example, the UAE drew up a list of, I forget, 40 or 50 organizations and people, et cetera, that it saw as responsible for extremism and terrorism. And clearly, it had the Muslim Brotherhood down, but it was Muslim Brotherhood any place in the Arab world, also Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, in the US, so much so that, and it was a real broad brushstroke, but so much so that at one point, the Obama administration came forward because they listed, for example, a major American organization. CARE, which is not necessarily a Muslim Brotherhood organization, et cetera. And Obama basically said after a couple of weeks that there was no basis for what was being said. But what we have in that then period and since that period is the attempt to marginalize as much as one can any kind of Islamic movement, not necessarily because while they might see it as extremist, the word extremism would be used within the context of political power, significant, even significant opposition. And so that has weakened, many of the parties.
The role of civil society and secularism, which you briefly mentioned, secular parties, particularly in Tunisia. What is the state or the status of that since the Arab Spring, say, in the Middle East? Do we see the beginnings of the development of civil society? What is the status of secularism, or as Pope Benedict called it, healthy secularism, and understanding how a citizen is a member of a nation state, regardless of their religion?
I think that, first of all, I think that the use of the term secularism, it can be very misleading there. That much of a transition. I think that the real issue is twofold. One, political democratization. In other words, governments moving to the point where you do have let's say, a strong parliamentary presence. It's hard to talk about that existing still in many of the countries. I think moving towards an acceptance, and for some, it's just actually strengthening an acceptance of diversity, within a country. Political diversity, I don't know. You can only go so far, because for many of the countries, they still remain authoritarian governments. So on the one hand, you can see change in Saudi Arabia, for example, and significant change that someone would look at and say, well, look, you have a greater empowerment of women. Of course, they start with the idea of driving a car, et cetera. One forgets that when MBS made that decision, he also did not free at the time a leading women academic who had been imprisoned because she had advocated this kind of
car.
Right. And then an opening up in terms of presence in society of a greater presence in society of women, but also in terms of the society, developing it in terms of entertainment, developing in a variety of ways. But what's important to note is the one area where it does not take place is in the political. And where you see that reflected early on is that early on in his tenure in office, or in his coming into office, you had the arrest of prominent Saudis, particularly businessmen, and imprisoned many of them for 3 months, and expected to give a significant amount of money to the government. The purpose of that was to send a message, as it were, not only to those who had to experience this, but to others in the society, that this is not going to be tolerated. So you don't have the toleration of political participation, political power or authority. It's buying into the notion that way back when authoritarian regimes would say, look, we can be a close ally of yours, but God forbid they come into power, in any way. And so there's difficulty there. Where that's going to go is it's hard to say. I don't see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel, moving forward. I think it's going to take a long time for a certain kind of change to take place. With certainly, but I should also say, because viewers will be aware of, for example, the fact that you had the coming together of the Pope and the senior imam from Egypt, much of that supported by the United Arab Emirates. And we see a number of events that have occurred. I do not take them super seriously when it comes to political change.
That's political change. What about on the ground, however, in terms of communal interrelations or dialogue or coexistence?
Yes. Then you see that, excuse me, it depends on the country, but certainly there's a significant presence and improvement there, at least in terms of symbols. The extent to which in the UAE, for example, they've always had, or at least for many years, churches, but those churches were mainly for their foreign workers who that didn't mean that they had political power or anything else.
No.
They had a job. But you do see a growth of churches, but also along with the mosques, you have synagogue, and you see a number of events that have to do with dialogue, both on religious questions and education questions that have been supported.
I'd like to have you comment a little bit more on, well, who were they afraid of? The they. Is it Islamic extremism? Is it Islamic groups? Is it socialism? Is it communism? Who are the they? Is it all of the above?
Egypt is a good example here. The Islamic movement, the principal Islamic movement that I'll talk about is the Muslim Brotherhood, which has played a major role. Now, what the Muslim Brotherhood and also some other Muslim groups did, but in a smaller way, they provided educational support for many, medical support, etc. And very often their medical support and educational support was something that Muslims and non-Muslims, could take advantage of. That was a challenge to the government. So, for example, you have a major earthquake. Who are the first people out there providing aid? And then what does the government decide after that? That it's going to ban anyone going out there before the government, as it were. But for a long time, these kinds of medical and social services and educational services were providing the alternative. And I can remember being in Egypt and really having a sense of just how expensive the regular hospitals would be, the limitation of access, etc. So in a sense, that's a threat. If it's an authoritarian regime, that's a political threat. And you see that in a number of countries. Therefore, in a number of countries, you not only attempt to control the political situation in differing ways, but also countries will have a concern about those movements that might want to, as it were, engage in a populist kind of assistance because that raises, issues. And so what you see in post-coup Egypt is government control in all of these major areas. And it's important to know too that one needs to take a look at what actually happened in order for that coup to take place. You had a slaughter of Muslim Brotherhoods at one of the major mosques, and then post that you had as many of it depends on the statistics. You have to look it up back then and today, but as many as 60,000 people, arrested, imprisoned, etc. The leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, a number of the top leaders have not only been in prison but died in prison. So it was a bloody coup. If we bring in the Christian dimension, it gets complicated in the sense that there have always been people that you can know from an older generation who are Christian and Muslim, who lived as neighbors, etc. But there have also been tensions in terms of some of the Christian groups vis-a-vis the Muslim groups, and also a sense that you had at times flare-ups where you'd have Muslim extremists, attacking a church, etc. The difficulty we have when we look at these scenes, and even as sort of analysts, etc., is taking a look to see how broad is this. In other words, does this represent, if you will, the mainstream aspect of religion, or not? And I think that's something that, in terms of media coverage, we don't really get a sense of. And I would just introduce here one of the ways to see, if you will, a comparative example of where we are. We are so dependent on mainstream media, but particularly on social media. And if you look at the coverage, for example, on what's going on in Gaza, okay, it is, and there are many studies that are out there. It is extraordinarily biased. Mainstream media, including mainstream American media, there was a major story that was done with regard to the New York Times, and the editorial office, as it were, indicating what kinds of words should be used and not. And so, including don't use Palestine too often in the article, but also how they reported it. How much did they report violence? What words did they use? Did they say, some were killed, and others were murdered? And we see that very heavily. And I think that that's also true when one looks at even the past, realizing how much both politics, media, and social media affect the way we then have a sense of what's going on there. I mean, I could say this as somebody who, when I got into the field, I never wanted to study Islam. I wasn't interested in it. I was trying to finish my PhD in Catholic theology. But when I did get into the field, one didn't know very much about it. And then in the early stages, one just realized that what was happening as a result of media, post-Iranian Revolution, post 9/11 especially, was the equation of the majority of a religion with the actions of extremists. Now, when I say to people that the extremists and terrorists are a fraction of a fraction, they immediately think, wow, this is ridiculous. You're exaggerating, whatever. But if you actually look at even the number of people who were in Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, and they were very dangerous groups capable of doing a lot of damage. But to say that's true for the whole group, or for that background, is part of what at times governments have played with that role, whether it's the governments in the region or whether it's Western governments. And so when we look today, where are we? We're back 10, 15 years. When we're talking about Western policy, the only thing that has happened here is in recent days, much more of a reaction on the part of many governments, European governments and others, who normally would have been silent or would have just simply been supportive of Israel and had just had stereotypes of all Palestinians. We have that now. The idea that all Palestinians are Hamas members is incorrect. The idea that the vast majority of people in Hamas were the kind of militant extremists, the militia side, is also not accurate. And then if you look at the media coverage on that, and even the initial government, and it's certainly, if you look at American foreign policy, the Biden administration has been totally biased on this issue. And it's an issue.
We talk here about the role of media and how media and our politicians sort of help each other in developing policy or enforcing policy. But now we have the rise of China and India and Russia and even the role of Iran. How is that impacting particularly the Middle East?
China has projected itself from Africa all the way over to Southeast Asia, in terms of economic support, etc. So they're really important. When it comes to Russia, look at the role that Russia played with regard to Syria.
Yes.
And that was the beginning of Russia in many ways becoming as big a force as it now has become an international player, and especially under Putin.
How does all this impact the person on the ground there, living there, communities?
I mean, for example, if you look at India, it impacts them tremendously. The level of violence against Muslims and also Christians at times. There have been, Christians that have been arrested, etc. Christian leaders. The extent is only now coming out. I mean, what has happened under Modi is that, and we forget this, Modi only a couple of administrations ago couldn't get into the country. They wouldn't give a visa, but for the last two presidents, Trump and Biden, you see them embracing, in fact, at times even physically. I think Biden had his arm in a photo op, on Modi's shoulder. The fact is, what's happening is that India has now, in declaring itself a Hindu state. So the whole idea was this is a great secular democracy,
yes,
a Hindu state. And also in doing it, if you actually look at what's being said, it's also being said that the recognition is that there's no place for Muslim. In India, you have the violence that takes place that doesn't catch the media in a lot of villages and cities where houses or places of business are destroyed, etc. So they're big players internationally, and the place of the U.S. and Europe is not the place that they had before. Sure, in some ways, there's a certain sense of great powers, but the fact is this is a much more competitive situation internationally.
Professor, it sort of brings us what you were just saying about these various ideologies and the role now, that the rise of this sense of the other. The article that you wrote for one 14 years ago, or was it 13 years ago, is Islam compatible with democracy? It seems as if the question should be, when or is an ideology or ideologies, are ideologies compatible with democracy?
I think that the risk is hardcore ideologies, unless the ideology is has a diversity built into it. You see, so I mean, and I think to bring in with that, let's take the ideology or theology of Christianity historically and Islam historically. In both cases, you have a sense of a religious tradition that had to struggle with diversity way back when. And there were examples in which one saw the ability to take if you will, a religiously pluralistic approach. One has to look at the unfolding of theologies or ideologies and how they've unfolded and how they were affected by the historical circumstances at the time, and then moved to today.
Interesting times, tumultuous, certainly, Professor. Well, I'd like to thank you. To thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts that certainly have given us not just something to chew on, but lots to chew on. And I'm sure our viewers will appreciate and want to know more and hear from you more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.